All right, I'm going to jump right in. So for the next 30 minutes, I want to share some of my experiences that I've had at the intersection between essentialism and entrepreneurship. If you can see my screen, you should see a picture on the left side that shows all the personal items that I own. I was homeless for about 3 years voluntarily because I wanted to free myself from anything that would just drag me down instead of creating value for myself. And you might ask why, and the reason where this journey started for me is with a weakness for simple questions that do not have simple answers. And it's led to a few interesting turns in my life. I've always been fascinated by questions like these, but over time, my decisions have become more and more strong and kind of life impacting. Among other things, what it's caused me to do is I've given up on having a permanent home in 2016. Luckily now I am back in a place, I at least have a temporary home, which was great for the quarantine. But for a few years before, I've basically lived on the go out of this backpack with just 64 black things. That's the second number that sticks out when I look at my life. And then another thing that it's led to is for some time I've traveled so much that I barely spend 3 days on average in the same place. If you look at my year 2017, this is where I've spent my time, and by where the one place where I've spent the most time was on airplanes, which was not the best experience, but I did it in pursuit of getting to know interesting projects and interesting people. Roughly 120 flights that year, many times around the globe. And while that being in airports and in security control and on planes was not a pleasant experience at all, it had one upside, which was, as a young boy, I always wanted to become an astronaut. And I realized that year I covered about 80% of the distance between Earth and the moon. But what are some of these questions that capture my mind and then lead to sometimes drastic changes in the way I live my life? This is one of the questions. What is it that makes me happy? And it's a pretty innocent question. I'm sure all of you have heard it before. All of you have asked yourself before. But one time when I heard this question was when I was working in a corporate job. And this was actually my first and only corporate experience. I was 23 or 24 years old. I was in London. After being in startups for a decade already, I thought maybe there's something more interesting on the other side of the river, or at the other end of the spectrum. And I took a project in a corporate environment. It took me about 91 minutes to figure out that that's not where I belong. And after starting there, even on the first day, I realized that I was going to go and try and complete my project earlier than originally agreed on, so that I could go back to what I love, which is learning about young startups and how to bring people together. But one thing that's left for me, and one thing that or the reason why I didn't like it, was that I saw that I had lots of interesting people surrounding me, lots of smart people, driven people. They all had a lot of energy. But what I realized is that they never took the time to ask themselves what it is that they want to do with that energy. They, at some point, had dreams of changing the world. The guy sitting next to me wanted to work on a cancer medication earlier in his life. And then at some point he took a job with the investment bank. They offered him a contract, and he let himself be caught in that golden cage. And I thought it was interesting that they never asked him, so they always had this idea of, you got to accumulate resources first before you can do with those resources what you really love. And I thought, in order to know if that's the only way to do it, first, I have to understand, what is it that I would do with those resources? What is it that I would love doing? What is it that kind of hits my resonance frequency, in the sense that the more I do put energy into it, the more energy I get out of it. And so even after finishing that project, that question kind of stuck with me. I was asking myself, what is it that truly makes me happy? What is it that gives me joy? Not just momentarily, but stuff, what is it that really drives me in life? And at first, there's a lot of things that came to mind, meeting friends, playing games, reading books, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure there's like 50 or more activities that I could list that give me some sort of happiness, but not this like lasting happiness that would let me get up happy in the morning and let me go back to bed happy, even if the day was crowded and lots and ups and downs have happened. What I've realized for myself over the course of about 6 months, by just writing every time I felt happy, I took notes, what was it that caused it, was that for me, the one thing that really makes me happy and gives me a lot of joy is learning, and specifically learning about what it takes to bring people together around an idea and let them grow the idea. The idea being something that could manifest itself as a startup, as a company, something that sustainably grows and impacts potentially a lot of people's life for the better. I personally was able to take first baby steps in entrepreneurship when I was 14. A friend of mine who was a bit older and I started building and coding websites. This was back in 2001, 2002, when lots of people thought they needed a website, but barely anyone knew why they needed a website, which was a great environment to be in for someone that was able to build websites and coding and all that, but didn't have much of a business sense back then. And then since then, the journey has taken me to quite a few places. I first started in Switzerland. That's where I'm right now as well. That's where I was born and raised. I spent quite a bit of time in Berlin. I've moved to New York later to work on a company called Small World, which was one of the very first social media networks. And I later moved to Hong Kong, built an online tailor from Hong Kong, and then later on ended up at the investment bank in London. After that, I thought it'd be great to nurture that passion, not just by going into one startup, one after another, but to be able to think and learn about what it takes to bring people together around an idea and supply them with the right tools and processes in parallel. And so I was fortunate that at that point, some of my earlier companies had done well, and I became an angel investor. I started investing. This was 6-7 years ago. And then in 2016, 4 years ago, the itch became too big and I wanted to get back in the driver's seat. I didn't want to be just a coach on the sidelines and giving people money and advising them, but I wanted to build companies myself. And I started 3 companies at the time. One is Glimpse. Glimpse is a analytics company for offline businesses. So it's kind of like a Google Analytics for your bar or restaurant. Zendesk is a productivity tool that allows people to work together well, even if they're never in the same office. That company was also fully distributed, fully remote, and we used the product ourselves to build the company. And then the third company that I co-founded in 2016 is Dfinity. Dfinity is a blockchain infrastructure project. Some people that were involved with Ethereum came up with some new math to create new consensus mechanisms. And that one was just fascinating for me because it allowed me to, what I love about blockchain is not only the technology offers so many intellectual challenges, but also it brought me together with a lot of people that thought differently and were willing to fight the status quo. And so by moving around from place to place, of course, my belongings just naturally became less. But at the beginning, I was still moving with a couple bigger bags. And another question that kind of stuck in my head at the time was how many things I actually own. And I thought it was interesting that I didn't have a good intuitive sense for whether I owned 100 or 200 items or maybe 1,500 items. And so what I did as a trained engineer, I went home. At the time, I still had a place just outside Zurich that I would have my stuff at, even if I only went there maybe a few nights a month. And I went home and I opened up Google Spreadsheets and I started collecting everything that I owned. I went through my flat and created a list of the items that I owned. And there were two learnings from this process. Number one, the number. I, at the time, had about 600 plus items. And second, it took me about 3 months to really complete the list. And that was much more fascinating than just the number, but the fact that I couldn't consciously list everything that I had, even if I tried. It took me about 2 or 3 months. To me, just was so interesting and told me a lot about how much baggage I've probably accumulated in my life. This is how the list looked. So back then, when I moved out, it got down to about 64 items. At the beginning, it had about 600 items. This roughly 50 items is the personal items that I own now. And another thing that I did at the time was publish it online, because I thought it was interesting to have friends and family challenge me on it. And that actually helped complete it a lot, because they came up with, oh, but you have this at my place, you've left this, or hey, here's another thing that you forgot because you didn't think of, I don't know, this extra credit card or an extra key. So that's just very brief, like part of my personal journey of how I've gotten rid of most stuff in my life, because I just realized that it made me feel liberated. It allowed me to move more freely, and it really served as a tool, not to just have less as a goal, but the goal was always to be happier and to be able to pursue my passions, which for me was to be with all these early stage companies and spend as much time as possible with them, because that's really what brings me a lot of joy. So about a year ago, I decided to leave my operational role at Dfinity and focus all my time on investing in what I now call global first teams. And global first as a term is something that we created. What we mean by global first, so me as a friend and I who invest in these companies, is not remote first companies. So the company doesn't necessarily have to not have an office or be completely distributed. But what I think is important for entrepreneurs nowadays is to free themselves from any given geography. What do I mean by that? I think the opportunity cost of only hiring people in Zurich, in Dubai, in Berlin, or wherever has just become so big now that it's easy to collaborate with people online and work so frictionlessly with each other. And today's conference, I guess, is one of the best proofs that it's become so easy for us to connect online. So the question I always ask is, how can we do more with less in my role as an investor? And here's a couple, I want to give you a couple examples where we applied that. So even though I wear the hat of a VC, I still very much see myself sitting on the same side as the entrepreneur, of the table as the entrepreneur, just because that's really where my heart is building these companies. And the reason why I've taken this hat as a VC is just to do it in more companies at the same time rather than just one. So one question that we of course ask our companies is do you really need an office? And I've personally built this company, Centask, that didn't have an office. And maybe just as a first question, it'd be interesting what you guys think. What are the pros and cons of not having an office? Like when you think of maybe your company not having an office or your company having an office, what are some obvious pros and cons? Yeah, just unmute yourself and just talk. Yeah.
So my name's Omer, based in London, but I've worked without an office because my business partner in my last startup was in Germany. So it was easier, and the money we would pay, we had a registered office. That's all you needed for the mail. And besides that, physically, you can be in a membership club or wherever you want. So I think, and we were working on quant systems, developing it for trading purposes, etc. Right? I found the pros of not having an office enabled me to click on, click off from work to whatever, anytime I wanted, which I find majority of the population isn't quite accustomed to, because they're very routine oriented. And so if they meet you at 8 o'clock, they're like, well, no, let's speak about work when it's work, you know.
Mhm.
And that's basically value / time optimization, right? And on the con side, my partner and I, we perform different functions. Our brains function differently. Like I'm sort of the conceptualizer, thinker, and envision the thing, and he will get into the nitty gritties. And I think that feedback loop through online channels would often delay things because visually you don't know what distraction they're dealing with.
Mhm.
And so a day or two later, the output is in there, or it requires an input to track the projects. So there I find that personal interaction, and I used to be on a trade floor, I was a derivatives trader. So
Huh.
an entrepreneur journey. So I think that's the positive side. So I don't know. I still don't have, it's what works, I guess.
What is one thing that you thought was harder in a distributed remote setup?
I think at times it was very, very objective oriented versus the subjectivity was lacking. And I think at times when, you know, when so I'm working with, we're tackling coronavirus, and there's a team of scientists in Toronto, and I'm the one that's trying to get them out of, like, get them some cash, for example, right?
Mhm.
To motivate them to say, hey, we've got this, don't worry. Like, just that personal touch is lacking in the distributive phase. Otherwise, functionally speaking, we can all function.
Yeah, I think what you just said, that's the number one thing that I hear, is that the word that people often use is company culture is much harder to build when you're distributed, this personal connection. And I personally, I'm convinced that it's not harder, but it's different. So you need to apply different processes. And I think to some degree, you need to rethink what company culture means and how you can nurture it. So I want to give you a few examples of why and how we approach this. First of all, one thing that you said, obviously a pro, is that you can work from anywhere as long as there's electricity and Wi-Fi. We're all connected, and the office can look different every single day, but we can have the same level of productivity and efficiency. Another thing that I've realized for myself is that it allows me to focus a lot more on what's really important rather than what's just urgent. So when I'm in a traditional office, it's so easy for people to come over and distract me and ask me to help them with something, where that help is still needed. But in a distributed setup, what we've done is we've documented a lot more. We've given people tools to help themselves. And so that's really helped us grow in the long term. And then the other thing that it helps me do is also be super focused on what is the role of a CEO or of a founder. And for me, it's really two things. Number one, I'm the pilot. I'm making sure that we have, we're going the right direction, where we have a certain flight level that we're holding. And then second, I make sure that everyone else in the company can work as efficiently as possible. I create an environment where all these smart people that I've hired, that I've been able to bring onto the team, can be as productive and as happy as possible. But how do we deal with building this personal connection in Centas, the distributed company? So for 90 days, typically, we would work remotely and we would only see each other through the screen. We'd use Slack, and sometimes it's kind of hard to understand who's the person behind the Slack name or on the other side of the screen. But then every 90 days, we bring people together for 7 days. Typically, it's somewhere where it's for everyone somewhat easy to fly to. And we spend 7 days together. And those 7 days we spend on two things. Number one, half the day, we spent planning the next 90 days so that once we separate again, everyone can be as productive and self-sufficient as possible. And then the other half of the day, and that's the much more important part, is we spend time to create memories together and get to know each other. And sometimes it's as simple as having lunch together, cooking together, and other times it's a bit more interesting. For example, this picture in the top right is when I told the guys we were going to go for a picnic, and we all got into a small bus, and then we went surprise skydiving. And for most of them, they'd never skydived before. So that was definitely an experience that everyone will remember, and it also gives you an interesting glimpse at people if they're put in a bit of a stressful situation sometimes. I've also learned at that point that not everyone likes extreme surprises as much as I do. So there was one guy that took the scenic route down. He did not want to. There's no way he's going to jump out of the plane. But overall, we're having good fun. Escape rooms is another activity that we like doing together, because it's kind of a bit of this like superficial stress situation, and it brings out characters a lot more than what we would usually see on a video call. I think one thing that's super important to me is that distributed doesn't mean you rely less on people or your team. I think one lesson that I've learned many times in sometimes painful ways is that a company is only as good as the company you're building it with, meaning it's all about the people. And it's important to make sure and over communicate that if you're in a distributed setup, because it's sometimes hard to see the full person behind the Slack name on the other side of the screen. The second way how we apply essentialism and try to achieve more by doing less in companies where we hire from all over the world is by thinking about our hiring process. So when I built my first company, which was just in one place, a small village, we would just hire by writing a briefing, putting that on a job site, getting all the CVs. And then what I would do is I would have a staple of these CVs. I would go through them. At the very top, I would still be awake and energetic, and I would pay attention. But then once I've had to look at more than 5 profiles, I know that we all have lots of biases, and I'm surely no exception. So I probably did a much worse job looking at the 5th candidate or the 10th candidate than what I was able to do with the first candidate. And so we thought, now that we're hiring from all over the world, and we sometimes get about 1,000 applications if we just hire for a generic role like a marketing person, how can we rethink hiring and this whole process in order to make it work in a distributed setup and make it a positive for us that we can hire from such a large talent pool and get so many applications, rather than being frustrated about having to go through 1,000 resumes. And so this is the part of the process that we've come up with, is to first write a very detailed briefing, not just about the job, but also give a clear idea of who we are, what we expect, what are our values, and how do we live them. And so this briefing takes you, this is not the full briefing, but it gives you an idea of the size. It probably takes you somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes to read it if you are just reading it word by word. So we put it out there. Here I said 800, so that's a typical number of applicants we would get either through our network or through some of these platforms. And then what do you think is the #1 skill we have to hire for when we're hiring in a decentralized or remote company, independent from the role? So of course, a marketing person needs to have certain skills that relate to marketing, but what's the other #1 skill that everyone needs to bring to the table?
Self-motivating.
Self-motivation, yeah, that's definitely one, yeah. So another one for us that we thought was super important is communication. People need to be able to express themselves, and they need to be able to do that and that has to do with self-motivation. They need to be able to do it in a setup where they are proactive about how they feel, what they want to achieve, how they're planning their work. If they hit a roadblock, they need to be able to say that. And communication has two sides, right? One is sending, but the other part, which is even more important, is receiving. And so one thing that we did to implement that in our hiring process is at the very end of this briefing, there's one line. If you're interested in this job, then please start your bid with exactly this line. Hey, Cedric, I'm the marketing person you're looking for. How many people do you think get this right? Let's say out of 1,000, how many people get that first line right when they send us their application?
Do you mean how many fail or how many get it right? Because the question on here is different from the one you asked.
Yeah, just say, well, yeah, we can keep it as fail. How many do you think fail?
50-50?
90%.
70%.
Okay. 70? Yeah, so
I think 90. People don't read till the end of the email.
Well, it's not even an email, it's a job application, right? But a job briefing. But yeah, I mean, same concept. It would take them about 5 to 7 minutes of concentrated work to get to that second page and see it. And for us, the number is about 85% that we see on average. 85% of people do not get that first line right. So that allowed us to go from about 1,000 people to just 150, and then we have a few more stages where we try to get those that are really good at communication identified early with just simple stuff like that. And of course, I'd love to go a lot deeper. I'm also very happy to connect after this, but I see that time is almost up already. I want to finish with this quote. Because sometimes I feel that essentialism and minimalism and travel and all that those are all terms that we think have all become en mode or something that's possible only since Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, since we can share and rent a ton of stuff that we previously had to buy. And that's why I like this quote: the secret of happiness, you see, is not found in seeking more, but in developing the capacity to enjoy less or do more with less. And what I love about it is that this was already said about 500 before Christ. And with that, I'm already at the end. Thank you guys all for contributing and spending your time with me. If you have any questions, I think we have a couple minutes. And otherwise, if anyone wants to get in touch, here's my contact info as well.
I had a question for you.
Yes.
In a sense, I've noticed that in general, when I've been around a whole bunch of entrepreneurs, VCs, etc., on traditional capital markets and alternative, etc., private markets, call it, right? There's always a focus on the success. And what I found, like a string of successes that are outlined, whereas I just find the failures were always forced you to either reinvent or like revert back. So it's a philosophy you follow in martial arts, for example, right? If you get beaten is how you figure out the probability of action sequence, right? And in applying that, and what I find is when working with a specific age group, it becomes more and more difficult. What are your thoughts, man?
So in general, I would say that the failures, and there's been a lot more failures on my journey than successes. The failures is where I grow and where I accumulate knowledge and experience.
Yeah.
And the successes kind of finance school, so to say. I mean,
Interesting.
That's personally my approach. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with failure. I think as long as you fail consciously And as long as you try to succeed consciously, there's absolutely nothing wrong with failure. I embrace every failure. They've made me who I am today. And the successes have just helped me make more failures, so to say.
Makes sense.
When you narrowed down from 600 to 63 physical things, what I didn't notice on the list was, have you ever evaluated the burden of a bank account or investments in and of themselves?
Yes, very much. I mean, also that I'm 100% cash and ventures. I don't have any public equities. I don't have any real estate. Exactly for that reason, because I want my brain to do one thing and think about one thing from when I get up and when I go back to sleep. Let's say business-wise, of course, there's personal relationships. So that focus definitely takes a toll on me as well. Like an additional bank account for me is not that much of an extra burden, but different things to think about. Definitely, I've reduced what I could, and I don't have a very balanced strategy, but I think that's the right thing for me to do, because I want to get world class at one thing, which is how identifying great companies early on. Cool. Well, thank you guys all for your questions and attention. I see that the time is up, and hopefully you guys will have a great remainder of the day. Feel free to connect anytime.